When looking at the movement of the spine, it's important to remember that the spine could move as a whole, or it might move in the different sections of the spine. So for example, we may go through a range of motion that is just impacting the cervical vertebrae, or we may go through a range of motion that is predominantly impacting the lumbar vertebrae, or for example, when doing a sit-up, it might just be affecting the thoracic vertebrae. Or if I was to do all three, so I flex my neck, I flex my thoracic, and I flex my lumbar, then that will be affecting all parts of my spine that can move. So all the movements are applicable to every section of the spine, but then it may also be applicable to all of the sections at the same time. So to begin with, there is flexion and extension. So flexion would be either looking down in your cervical vertebrae, doing a sit-up movement in your thoracic, or rounding your lower back off in your lumbar. So that would be flexion. The opposite to flexion would be extension. So in our cervical vertebrae, if we're in this position, we are going to extend up, or we can keep on extending and looking up. Extension in our thoracic would be to lean backwards and get that backwards lean, which is extension. Or again, in our lower back, we will be extending our lumbar. So we've got flexion or extension. When we lean to the side, we would call that lateral flexion. The lateral means that you're going to the outside of your body, so you call lateral flexion, and it can also be lateral flexion that way. Now, for you to go from this position back to the middle, you can call it lateral extension, as you're then coming back to neutral, and then you're going lateral flexion that way. So you can have lateral flexion and lateral extension. And then finally, you can have rotation. So rotation can occur, again, just in your cervical vertebrae. So you have your C1, which is your very first cervical vertebrae, which is almost like a disc. And then your C2 is like a peg. Your C1 is actually connected to your skull. So that C1 sits at the bottom of your skull and then sits on a peg. And that allows you to look left and right. But you can also get rotation of your thoracic vertebrae, and then you can also get rotation of your lumbar. But generally speaking, the lumbar doesn't want to and doesn't like rotating very much. So we generally get the rotation from the thoracic. A good example would be when sat in a car seat or on a chair, and you're trying to look in that blind spot. A lot of that rotation will come from your thoracic vertebrae, and your lumbar is normally fixed and facing forwards. When looking at rotation of the spine, it's also important to understand the risk of injury. So our spine is allowed to rotate. We should promote rotation, but there's also certain degrees of angles that are acceptable. Generally in the cervical and the thoracic, we can get quite large ranges of rotation. In the lumbar, it's very small. Something to look at is what you may call a refraction angle. So if your hips are facing forwards, but your shoulder gill is quite rotated, then the refraction angle would be the angle at which your hips are forward and at what angle your shoulder gill is facing the other way. The bigger that refraction angle, the increased risk of injury eventually. So that will be very common in tennis players where they could be facing forwards but rotating, as well as in situations like golf maybe. But we also need to be careful of the application of certain core exercises in terms of what people call Russian twists. The aim of those Russian twists would be to stabilize the lumbar and to cause rotation from the thoracic. If the client doesn't know how to do that, then they are at risk of causing that rotation. Maybe the thoracic isn't quite strong enough, or maybe the lumbar isn't capable of bracing statically. And as they rotate a bit too far or a bit too quick or with a bit too much weight, they start to rotate from the lumbar vertebrae, and that could then start to cause damage and other concerns in the lower back.